particular moment. And it's the biggest difference with it would be Kingdom Death Monster is something that you wouldn't bring to a game night or something. It's something that you arrange with your gaming group. Those three, not including Gloomhaven, but Imperial Assault or Descent, arguably you could bring it out on a one-time basis and you do your one dungeon or your one thing. Even more so Imperial Assault with the skirmish mode. But Kingdom Death Monster is not something that you would do a one-off. It's definitely you're in for the long haul or not at all, as far as I'm concerned anyway.
Yeah, no, I agree. When you're playing a game of even Gloomhaven, I think to a certain extent, and I think that Gloomhaven is in many ways the natural comparison. Even just in terms of how they were released, these were both labors of love of individual designers who wanted to self-publish. Isaac Childress, who did Gloomhaven, he had published something before, namely Forge War, under his own steam. But Gloomhaven as well was kind of a campaign that got out of control, and more things got stuffed in, and we ended up with this massive box that a lot of people underpaid for. But the salient difference to my mind is, and this is why you don't play one-offs, I would play a one-off of Gloomhaven, because I think the primary virtue of something like Gloomhaven is in the core combat mechanics. The core combat mechanics of Kingdom Death Monster are not so hot. I mean...
No, as far as I'm concerned, it's all about, like you said, building your settlement, finding out the nuances that come in, like what new and unusual thing is going to happen to your poor villagers next, right? And do not get attached to your heroes in this game.
Yeah, and I don't mean to rag on the game too much because I do love it. I'm invested in Kingdom Death Monster, but any individual piece of the gameplay is not compelling to me. Honestly, like there's nothing, I can't point to any mechanics that really sing to me or are novel or particularly well done, with the possible exception of the way the gear grid works. There's a bit of cleverness in terms of, equipping your survivors and trying to make things work. There's a sort of puzzle mechanic where you slot things together, and that can give you some, they're called affinities, and it can give you some minor bonuses. But past that, it's really just roll to hit, roll to confirm, draw a card, see what happens. And it really is through the new stuff. It's the new stuff coming in at a constant basis. What's the next event that's going to happen? What's the next terrible thing that's going to occur? What's this, I see, 2 years down the line, 2 years in the game, down the line something weird is going to happen. I wonder what that is. Unlike a game like Gloomhaven, which again, it sells itself on the core card play. Not that I want to talk too much about Gloomhaven in this context.
No, I was thinking of how to compare it this morning. I was thinking about you could compare it to maybe one of these new apps with microtransactions where you're paying with the death of your villagers, right? So you pay with little amounts, and that gives you new stuff every time.
That I think is a really apt comparison. It is a free-to-play game that is powered by microtransactions of human suffering.
Exactly.
Very nicely put. It's bizarre because I want to make another perhaps unfair comparison. To me, when I think of Kingdom Death Monster and my enjoyment of it, because I do enjoy it a great deal, I'm reminded a bit of Sentinels of the Multiverse. Not for any particular gameplay comparison, but because when I take a step back, I love playing Sentinels of the Multiverse. But when I take a step back and I look at the game, and I ask myself, is this a well-designed game? My answer is no. I love playing it. I'll play it at almost any opportunity. But a lot of it is pretty stupid. And I realize that sounds terribly insulting, and to a certain extent it is. But in Sentinels of the Multiverse, you draw a card, you play a card, more or less. Yeah. And in Kingdom Death Monster, you do the best you can to equip people. And then you send them into this meat grinder where you're basically just chucking dice for a while, and you see how many people die. And the number of times, which brings me to my number one complaint about Kingdom Death Monster. This is a legitimate complaint. This isn't me just talking about how it's stupid but awesome, but this is where it's stupid but unpleasant, I think. The number of times where you're told to roll a d10, just a simple d10 on a table, and a 1 or a 2 means you die, is just way too high. Yeah. And this isn't a difficulty complaint. Like, whatever, make a game hard. I like some hard games, but this is just and the number of times I've seen... Look, I haven't played Kingdom Death Monster a ton. I've played it a couple dozen times, I think, all told, in terms of individual sessions. I've seen total party kills on random events where nobody had any choices. It was literally a situation where, like, okay, next step, roll on this table. Okay, next step, roll on this table. Okay, next step, roll on this table. End result, total party wipe. And nobody chose to do anything. This wasn't like, oh, do you want to do this risky thing? Or do you want to proceed to the next table? No. Because there are some of those, and those I prefer. This is simply, oh, this result says this result says this, now we're all dead.
True, and on that same topic, I was going to ask you, do you remember any combat situations where we didn't either all completely wipe or all completely live and destroy the monster? I don't remember a particular instance where one person got down to, to the very end where it's either a do or die situation. It all seemed to be either the monster killed all of us or we destroyed the monster completely.
Well, there was that one time when, to answer your question, no, not that I can recall, maybe it's happened. There was that one time that somebody survived with a crippling, debilitating injury, which I guess is close enough-ish. There was one time when we got a total party wipe on a combat encounter where it looked like maybe the two people were going to pull it out. That was on one of the Nemesis encounters, and I think... Or maybe I was just being hopelessly naive. But, and that I think, again, speaks to how sort of... how relatively simple the combat mechanics are. You go in there with 4 survivors. When one of them dies, you're now down to 75% combat capacity. And the monster is still at 100. And so... Or at least... hasn't been disadvantaged by having lost a character. So yeah, it's a very steamroller-y kind of effect. And the game kind of encourages... So the flip side of that, to the sort of steamroller effect of a total party wipe, the game encourages grinding. Like, you're encouraged in certain contexts to have your fully kitted out survivors go do the combat encounter that they've done 2, 3, 4 times before, because they know they can get it done without losing anybody. And that's not terribly satisfying either. Again, to contrast it with any of those other dungeon crawls you do, you get to move on to other scenarios and do other things.
Get the next new shiny thing.
Yeah. Whereas and that really highlights the thing you said before that I was commenting on. When Kingdom Death isn't showing you constantly new stuff, it's not the most compelling experience.
That's right. It drags. But it does have, I'm going to just talk about the interesting mechanics that I like, and that's the monster deck. Like, as he takes wound, his monster deck gets lower. This is no spoilers, so as you do wounds, his hit points are equal to his combat deck. And as you hurt him, his combat deck's smaller, so his moves are more...
Predictable.
So I think that is a great mechanic.
It is. I do like... And that is one of the ways in which Kingdom Death smuggles in variety in where other games might not be able to. The fact that even if you're grinding, and you're probably going to be able to raffle stomp some terrible monster, at least the actions it's going to do might vary a little bit. And that provides a little bit of diversion to sort of undercut my previous criticism. And yeah, as the monster gets wounded, it pares down the available action to a smaller subset. And those are, I think, some of my favorite parts of the combat encounter, where you're down to just a couple of cards, and maybe one of them is terrible and one of them is awesome. Either for you or the monster. And you're just hoping that the next wound is going to narrow it down in your favor. And then... basically, it's the equivalent of the monster triggering, Berserk mode or something. If the last card in its deck, so it's going to do this every turn, is just terrible for you, that is one element that I think is really good. And okay, fine, it's actually pretty clever. I'll take back what I said before.
And the next one is the art. I think the art is amazing. The fact that they show you what your totally kitted out character is going to look like in their new, improved, full set of gear. I think that really adds to what you're striving for. It's the same thing that they have in like World of Warcraft or any of these other online or things that they dangle it in front of you, and this is what you could have, right? It gives you motivation to get to it. Plus the bonuses it gives is pretty cool.
I find it strange that you're saying this because I'm the one that has to build all the minis.
That's the other part we can go to, right? The miniatures are amazing, fully customizable, like to exactly the kit that you have on your guys, and there's like millions of different variations you can have on these figures.
Yeah. He's moving away from that now, actually. He's not going to be doing the sort of customizable kits anymore. And I can understand why. The tooling cost was just prohibitive, and it just made every time there was a new gear expansion, it meant he had to make tremendous quantities of minis. So from now on, there's just going to be one sort of archetypal mini fully kitted out in the appropriate stuff. But now, since we're on the topic of art and the miniatures, I think it is important for us to talk about the two giant elephants in the room, and that is titties. Because I think that it's fair to say that a certain amount of the notoriety that the game first got when it was on Kickstarter, and one of the reasons why it cracked 2 million, was on the strength of titties. And I mean, here's the thing, and I'm gonna say my take on it, and then Walker might or might not disagree with me. So, from my perspective in the gaming universe, there's sort of a sliding scale from good, progressive, and by progressive I just mean non-exclusionary, just an effort to render women as women look, and or women might hypothetically look in a sort of reasonably plausible way, such that they look like powerful individuals rather than adolescent male fantasy wish fulfillment. And quick shout out to a friend of mine, Chris Cheslick. One Deck Dungeon to me is a perfect example of that. Without saying anything about it, all the characters are women and they're all rendered well. And I mean, some people show up on Board Gaming and say, "Oh, I can't play this game with my son now." It's like, well, you can go screw off. It's just quiet and decent. Aeon's End is a game that I didn't particularly like, but it was a majority female cast. Again, relatively understated about it. But Kingdom Death, the art in Kingdom Death is pretty much on a sliding scale from, pretty standard warrior babe, adolescent power fantasy, all the way to more or less softcore pornography. And to its credit, you can emphasize what you want, like the really sort of the pinups, as it were, the add-on pinups don't have any gameplay elements associated with them. You just buy them for the model exclusively, and so I don't have any of those. I didn't get any of those. And the actual art in the game in the rule book is, I'm not a prude. It's not to my taste. It's clearly for the male gaze. It's clearly to titillate the male audience. So I have no objection to skin necessarily. And it's about context and presentation and all these other things. I mean, that having been said, I can curate my experience of it so that, all the miniatures that I have are closer to just the warrior babe archetype than anything else. I don't know what your thoughts are as a consumer.
There was an article today just made me think of this body shaming thing and people being uncomfortable with nudity, but in this particular case, it's an unrealistic representation of that sex, right?
Yeah.
Right. They have a generic man, but then they have this, unrealistic version of what a naked woman would look like. So nudity, I think, is fine, but have it at least realistic. You know what I mean?
Yeah, especially since if you're going to be selling me nightmarish horror fantasy, then this sort of voluptuous, soft focus lens, perfect hair vision of the world is kind of really even all the more galling.
Exactly.
This isn't to condemn anyone that likes it or anything. It's just not to my taste. I would have liked it to have been a little bit more consistently rendered.
Well, like one of these, like enough already.
Yeah,
like that's.
Yeah.
We've seen it. We've done it back in Conan days. Let's get with today's day and age, please.
Yeah, and besides, just to give perfect fairness to the creator, it's not. He does have some things that I think are clearly meant to unsettle the male audience. For example, a number of the monsters have anatomical features, without going into too much detail, that are clearly meant to be unsettling to your average gamer guy. And I'm all in favor of that. Again, I'm not a prude. I don't mind if it depends on what it's being done, what effect it's seeking to achieve, and all the nightmarish stuff, all the genuinely unsettling stuff, because there's a fair amount of genuinely unsettling art in the game. I'm all in favor of that. But then the juxtaposition of that, of the death and the perversion, and I mean perversion in the best possible sense, juxtaposing that with sex, the way that it's presented in this game, is a bit weird.
Exactly.
And unfortunate. Other thoughts, Walker?
That would be it for Kingdom Death Monster from on my end.
Yeah, I mean, I've just spent a lot of time talking about what I don't like about it. But to sum up, I do like the game a lot, but a lot of what the game is about discovery, seeing new stuff. And so I can't really go into too much detail without spoiling too much. It's just, if you've ever liked fun paperwork in a game, if you've ever, enjoyed that, sitting with your sheet of paper trying to min-max something, or if you've enjoyed games like Warhammer Quest, or if you like Gloomhaven but want kind of the nightmare inverse image of games like that, then I highly recommend giving it a shot. It's an expensive investment, but try to seek somebody out with a copy and play a round or two and see what it's like.
Where are you going to gauge it on replayability? Like, say if we get through this long campaign, what are your thoughts on that?
That's where the expansions come in, right? Like, so as I've said, you spend a lot of time fighting the same monster, and even though there's a bit of variation, so every campaign has a certain number of monsters to plug in, but there's lots of different versions, lots of different expansions that replace those monsters. Sick and tired of fighting a white lion? Well, go and kill